Hey everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Translating into Android, a Designer's Perspective. So today we will have the opportunity to learn a little bit about translating design from iOS into Android and back again. And you'll have the opportunity to submit some questions to Micah by typing your questions into the question pane on the side. And at the end of the session, we'll be doing a Q&A to go over any questions you guys may have. And now I'd like to introduce Micah, our Director of User Experience at Worry-Free Labs.
Hey, thank you very much, Morgan. All right, as this kind of a self-introduction for a little bit of context, so my background is originally in graphic design, more in both digital and print media. I've done anything from working for like e-commerce to I worked for like a large, for Johnson & Johnson doing packaging for a while. And over the last 3 or so years, I've found myself in the mobile sphere, focusing just on user experience. I'm the Director of User Experience here at Worry-Free Labs. And kind of leading the design effort. So that's who I am. Also, just kind of wanted to set some expectations for this webinar. First off, this isn't all-encompassing. It's kind of a primer and mostly focusing on just specifically on the design elements and what kind of is the difference between the two platforms and how we approach them. So it's less technical, not so much about development, but focusing on just the design and specifically on UX design, meaning wireframes and that sort of thing, although we will kind of talk about UI, the visual side as well, as needed. And secondly, I'm really horrible at spelling, so if you see any spelling mistakes in the deck, please ignore those. Thank you. All right, so let's jump right in. I titled it iOS to Android to iOS. Basically, you can put your hand over whichever iOS you want to, just depending on which direction that you want to go. So let's start with the question. Why are we having this conversation right now, specifically? And it's basically, and this, some people may not like me for saying this, but it's basically because Android is now a real player in the market. Over the last couple of years, they've definitely been growing their user share, and everybody knew that was happening. But it's much broader than that. With the introduction of Google's material design, Android is finally kind of locked into kind of a visual language that they are trying to make more standard. And they've also, and also just users as a whole are becoming taken more seriously. And the reason for that is the Google Play Store and the other Android markets are starting to bring in a lot more money. Up until maybe even this last year, our clients would come to us and say, hey, I want to design an app. And we'd say, okay, what platforms? And almost entirely would be like, well, we want iOS because sure, there may be more Android users throughout the world, but iOS users, hands down, just spent more money. They bought more in-app purchases. They upgraded their apps more. They just bought the apps outright. When Android users tended to be more about kind of like free apps and that sort of thing. That tide is shifting, not so much shifting. iOS still holds those users, but Android has the Android user as a whole spends more money in the mobile marketplaces. And then Android also, this is something they've always had, but is also a big key for some clients or some projects, I should say. Android has stronger flexibility within their ecosystem. And that comes, it's a bit of a double-edged sword in that It's somewhat of a wild west in that you can pretty much do anything you want to in Android, whereas iOS is a lot more locked down because they focus just on the Apple ecosystem. But it goes both ways, and that kind of like free-form way of handling your phone and the system as a whole allows you to do certain things that you wouldn't. One example for this, we have a client called Basis. They have some really wonderful charter schools throughout the United States, and we help them design a tabloid app that they use within their classrooms. And what they needed as part of was one of the features is to be able to be within the app but launch other applications, be it a calculator, be it even a browser, or pretty much any application that the teacher thought would be useful in that class, in that setting. So iOS basically will not, specifically at the time, would not let us kind of like reach out from app to app. There was no like sandboxing. There was no kind of like creating our own little world that involved other apps. Android, however, did have that ability, and so we specifically designed and built in Android in that case. So I would say the majority of the applications, it doesn't matter, but every once in a while, it is kind of decided for you based on what you want to do. All right, so if we are doing now, at the beginning I told you that most of our clients would come to us and say we want to do iOS first, see how it works out, and if we make money, if this is a hit, then we'll kind of build out Android and Windows or whatever the case may be. Now, almost all of our clients, pretty much the same amount on the flip side, come to us and say, we are doing iOS, Android at the same time, and we are leading with both, and if those do well, then maybe we'll think about Windows, although that tends not to be on the table very much these days. All right, so if we're doing both, how do we organize the process? Like, obviously, it's hard to think of two things at the same time. And the answer to that is it depends. You want to first focus on the strengths of the two platforms. We talked a bit about that just now, but iOS has a really strong user base. I put Kool-Aid because basically there's a lot of people that have been drinking the Apple Kool-Aid for a long time, and in full disclosure, I am one of them. But those users, they know the ecosystem, they know how things work. They kind of have this language that they all speak. Also, the App Store for Apple has been traditionally stronger with a more curated selection, and so yes, they do have billions of apps, but generally when navigating, you'll kind of stay within a area of like quality products. When the Android marketplaces tended to be a little bit harder the cream didn't rise to the top as well. And then iOS is also they're the original with the iPhone and smartphones, and so they sort of set a standard. Android, on the other hand, they have material design, which we'll talk a bit in and it's really wonderful. Google really did a great job. Also the flexibility that we discussed, and this constantly growing user base, both financially as well as just pure numbers. And then also going with this material design, Android has some really nice animations and kind of like nice touches that can be added, polish to apps. That is kind of built into the ecosystem as opposed to having to custom do everything. All right, so we've decided, and I will say that the majority of the time, in the previous question here at Worry Free Labs, we usually tackle the iOS app first, and then translate over to Android. That is not always the case. It really just depends on which one our clients want, and which one just sort of makes more sense. Probably the reason we like to target iOS first is because we have a bit more experience on that side. And so it just feels, it just kind of is our strength. With that said, we have done vice versa. And as you'll see, these days translating is not as hard as it used to be. All right, so we know we need to design both. We know that, okay, so let's talk about this question. How do we do that so it translates nicely? So now the goal is no longer, I want to design an app that's really awesome, and then I want to kind of retrofit it for another system so that it works there too. The goal now is, I want to design that is awesome, design an app that is awesome, period. So we need to design a way that is not system dependent. And really the way you do that is by understanding both of the systems and knowing where specifically they are different from one another. And having all those things in your mind, you can then design an experience. And then whether you start with Android or iOS, it doesn't matter, because you've kind of in the back of your mind, you've had these things sitting there, and so the translation process is easy. All right, I want to, okay, so yeah, basically what I said. So how do we focus more on like what makes them unique? Because frankly, the two systems are becoming more and more alike. It seems like Apple is stealing as many Android ideas as Android has stolen Apple ideas. So, all right. So I'm going to ask you to say hello to Arcos. Arcos is a golfing application. The company creates a small hardware chip that fits on the end of golf clubs, and it uses Bluetooth to send the information of your swing, but more primarily the geolocation of your club based on when you hit the ball. And then you go, and when you hit the next ball, it knows like where you are relative, so it knows the distance that you just hit the ball. It's this really great, sophisticated system, and really smart, and an amazing client. And they allowed us to share this work that we did for them. So we started with iOS. No, actually, let me, that's not entirely true. Actually, they came to us with an iOS app already developed, and we are working with them both on the design and the development side to translate it into Android. So one of the first things to think about is the difference in navigation. The major difference is iOS really pushes a bottom style navigation, and the reason for this is that when you hold your phone, your thumb just sort of sits nicely across the bottom, and so theoretically those bottom buttons should be like things that you hit often, and therefore you want them at the bottom and within easy to reach. That's the same reason, and it's not pictured here, but an Android phone has like your home and your back button at the bottom. So that is the iOS approach. Android, on the other hand, has a top navigation system. The one you see here is the hamburger slide out. So you click on the hamburger menu, it slides out here, and you've got your navigation there. They also have a version which is basically the bottom navigation on iOS, but it's up at the top. Stylistically it's different, but conceptually it's about the same. Another navigational element you'll see here is this multi-page layout. In this case, they're kind of tabs, and Android has a very distinct style where it's underlined, and as you swipe through or tab over, you go to different approaches. So in iOS, what they used are these like dots to represent multiple screens. In Android, they use their tabs. In iOS, you have the bottom navigation. In Android, you have the slider. Now you can see how the functionality doesn't change, just the way that it's organized. So I want to show you something to watch out for. You may recognize this app as it's Instagram. So it's kind of fascinating that they haven't fixed this yet, but you can obviously see the problem here. Instagram was an iOS-only app for years even, and they had enough people yell at them, we want an Android version, that they finally created it. But ultimately, they did do a few things, like you see that they have the kind of the action dots up here instead of the settings button. But ultimately what they did is they kind of just ported it over and put the bottom navigation in an Android phone. And you could see very plainly why that doesn't work. It's because it's right next to your back and your home buttons. Another designer here was just telling me this morning, she's like, I hate that because I can't tell you how many times I wanted to do a search and I found myself accidentally hitting the back button. So yeah, this is a fail, frankly. And one of the few things that should really be, or one of the many things that you need to think about, and so avoid. All right, so we talked about this a bit, but you can see here another tabbing function or feature that iOS uses is kind of these kind of pill style tabs, and Android pretty much just has the one style. Let's see, action sheets. So these are very like iOS and Android pulling from the SDK when the developers make this things, but we have to keep in mind where these elements happen natively when we design and how. So for instance, if I click on the big one that uses this is add a photo. And in iOS, the action menu slides up from the bottom and it says, do you want that to come from, do you want to take a new photo? Do you want it to come from your photo album, or do you want to cancel? Android, on the other hand, has their actions typically in the top right corner, and clicking on them will bring an action menu that's like this. However, this action menu can come up in other areas of the phone. So in this case, same feature, but just location is different, and it doesn't affect the design a ton, but it is something that really needs to be factored in. And this is the little things we need to focus on. This goes into UI design specifically on the visual side, but you'll notice that just the way that the toggles here work. iOS has a very specific, clunky, bulky toggle, and then Android is a bit more streamlined. You may like this one visually a bit more. I'm on the fence personally, but the reason that these things are important is not usability. The same designer we were talking a little while ago about, she's a dyed-in-the-wool Android user, and she basically said, like, Android users are so used to iOS apps that have been ported into Android that they'll use whatever. Like they can navigate through any type of navigation, just because Android for so long has just kind of been a Wild West. So it's less about doing things like this so that Android users can use the feature. Like if they saw an iOS style toggle, they would totally flip it like it was no big deal. However, when you keep in mind these things and you do use the Android style toggle, basically what you're telling the user is, we know what your home is like. We're building this for your home, and we want you to feel at home in our app, which obviously is a very important thing. Another one of these that we talked about before was similar to these camera choices. As you can see the difference there. And this is an interesting thing, and iOS actually does not have a standard here, but we focused on it when we were recommending changes for the Android version. Is Google has sort of introduced, mostly in their own apps, this style for tooltips, and it's really a great style. Basically, they darken the screen, they put a spotlight on one element, and then just at the bottom they said, this is what it is. And then you hit got it. And sometimes that spotlight will move to another area and it'll say this is what it is, and you say next. And it's this really clean, simple way of teaching a user how to navigate or use your application, that I think we'll see that start coming into other apps, both on Android definitely, but I think iOS may take a few pages out of the Android book in this case. All right, I want to move into some other areas. Basic on how the two systems are different. This goes very specifically into material design, and this is about surfaces and depth. So iOS basically uses this idea of like focus as a way to help the user pinpoint into one area. You'll notice that the background has kind of blurred out, and so we can read the text better. It's very much about like transparency layers and that sort of thing. Android has taken in material design a very physical approach to it. I mean, they call it material design because it's modeled after like literal pieces of paper stacked on top of one another. And so what you see are like drop shadows and buttons that appear to be raised and that sort of thing. And this is a nice like side shot, but if your phone was three-dimensional, basically you could see that this drop shadow is greater because it's higher. And literally in material design, you assign the height of different objects, which changes the drop shadow, which changes the way that a user interacts with it. So if you have not, we'll talk about resources at the end, but if you have not read through the materials design documentation, it's really excellent. The other thing is density pixels. iOS, because it has a very contained ecosystem of phones, basically you've got your iPhone 4, which is one size, your iPhone 5, which is the same screen size but a little taller, your iPhone 6, which is the same proportions, but it just is kind of stretches them a bit from the iPhone 5, and then the iPhone 5 or 6 Plus, which is the same ratio, but has a higher pixel density. So yes, the iOS, there are a few phones you have to keep in mind, but obviously on Android there's a whole lot more. You've got anything from like this is small little phones about the size of an iPhone 4 to your phablet, and even into your tablets, and where people can just have these and everything in between. So you have to deal from a phone that's like 330 pixels wide to one that has, because of it's a high-res display, to in the thousands. So there's a lot to keep in mind, and for that reason, Android has, or Google has introduced this idea of density-independent pixels, which I don't want to go into too much, but it is a really nice strategy for their situation. And as you're designing it, you have to keep that in mind, and sort of like, so you're designing for things to stretch and grow, and you're able to assign how it stretches and grows. Does it just scale up, or does it just stretch horizontally, or that sort of thing? And you can control that. And as a designer, you should be the one that dictates that and kind of gives that message to the developer, so that your designs can stay true to the initial vision. All right, so as a recap there, navigation, that's probably the biggest thing to really focus on. Like, how do you manage the two? And there are lots of different ways. You can just, if you've got a bottom nav you love, you can just throw it up to the top, change the styling, and you're good to go. If you have a bottom navigation that you kind of wish had a few more elements, you can put it into a hamburger and actually have a lot more space there. We've done iOS apps that already have a hamburger navigation because there were a lot more navigational points to reach from the home screen, and that obviously translates really easily. Basically the only thing we had to adjust there was the actual way material design handles sliders, which for iOS visually, I think the slider tends to be above the base of the regular screen, and Android tends to be below, or vice versa. I kind of forget off the top of my head. And to be honest, like iOS doesn't have a standard there, but it does tend to, the trends tend to be opposite of one another. Multi-page structure, that was about all the tabs system that we looked at. System messages like grabbing a picture or that sort of thing. The back button, I didn't discuss that yet, but basically the thing that has to be kept in mind for Android specific is that the user has a hard-coded back button on their phone. It often is a physical button, but more and more it's a virtual button that is always on their screen. And it allows them to move back, obviously. Now, however, as these things are designed and developed, you can kind of dictate a little bit of what that back button does. So does it act very much like an iOS back button, or does it always take them literally back to the screen that they were just on? There are so many scenarios on how screens navigate from one to another that I don't want to get into too many differences on how that can be different. But it is something to like always keep in mind. And even if your strategy is just as simple as we just want back buttons to always work the same, either on iOS or Android. And in fact, we may literally put a back button on the top left corner, like many Android apps do, and have the back button do exactly that same action. That's a strategy to take. But really, the key message I'm trying to make is you need to think about it, and it's important. Yeah, and then we talked about the little things, icons, toggles, etc. Like anything from the share icon. They have different share icons, frankly, and you don't want to use an iOS share icon on an Android because your Android users are going to know it, and they're going to know that it's kind of an amateur mistake. And also just sort of stylistically, they often change. And then we talked about depth and pixels. So there were, I obviously spoke probably way too fast, and there were a lot of things that I went over just now. But I do hope that it doesn't feel like daunting, this task of designing for both, because ultimately what it comes down to is both systems are flexible, and as long as you develop things in a thoughtful, clean manner, they're going to translate nicely, and there's good ways to do that. I am going to open it to questions before, no, we'll do questions since that's how the slides are ordered. And
hey, Micah, great job. Really, I know you're doing very well, and I am opening up to any questions that anybody may have.
If you have access to the chat feature, feel free to post anything there.
I see a question. So it said, could we get access to the recording and the presentation after the fact? Yes, of course. We will be sending out an email with the recording, so you guys can listen to this again and go through the slides again. So of course, we will definitely share that. And are there any other questions? Well, I guess, Micah, if you could go into what do you think is so great about, Google's material design and how that affects Android apps?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to switch over to the website of material design. Their kind of their guidelines. Let's see. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
All right, excellent. So this is, and it's in the resources section, which we'll share with you. This is Google's the material design guide, so to speak. And there are a couple. There's one that's a little bit more focused toward developers. This one is focused on design. I'll tell you what I really like about material design, and keep in mind, like, I own an iPhone. That's what I use every day. But as a designer, I really think that Google nailed it. And the reason why they did it so well is because they didn't come up with anything brand new. There's nothing in here that's amazingly groundbreaking. What they did is just use fundamental, strong design elements and put them together in a way that like anyone, or any developer, I should say, can come in, take advantage of these, and make a beautiful, cohesive experience for the users. So first off, like as someone who like really loves tactile design, I love the fact that they modeled it after like actual materials, like almost like it's built from pieces of paper stacked on top of each other. Um, so that's one of their principles, like this idea of like physical objects as a metaphor for different elements on design. It's also very bold, and then motion. I love the way that it handles animation, and hopefully I'll go through that a bit. I don't want to go through this whole guide because it's pretty long, but I'll point out the things that I like most. So let's see if I can see. Yeah, this idea of depth. So the way that they use depth is everything is kind of like basically 1 pixel thick, like a sheet of paper. And so rather than having like larger things on top of smaller things, it's all about like how it's like layered on top of one another and how high it is. And as you go through this, they've got really beautiful kind of animations, so you can see, okay, so that's how it affects. So if I raise it higher, you can see the physically, or I guess digitally, the shadow changes. And then also, even though they're modeling it after physical pieces of paper, so to speak, you also have this really great digital element. Like that piece of paper is magic. It can change in any way. It can grow, it can shrink, it can cut in half. What's on it can totally change. And that's really kind of exciting and interesting. And the way that the content of the piece of paper or fits on there, or the material as they say, is very versatile. And you'll see that like one of the things that's so exciting about these is that this is all animated, and within material design, this type of animation, which is really about the polish of your application, is like becoming more standard. It's becoming a lot more easy to implement, instead of needing like a strong knowledge in kind of animation. In like OpenGL or that type of thing. So those are probably the most, what I love about the material design. I think also just from a visual standpoint, both like like elements like the cards themselves, but also the standard typography and that sort of thing. I feel like Android just is really, they have some good designers working for them right now, and they are actually ahead of the game, in my mind, compared to Apple and iOS.
Well, great, Mike. I think it's really impressive to see that this material design is really gaining a lot of respect in this space. We do have another question. Would using material design principles such as the tab system be okay without using the drop shadows? And I think this question comes from Ginny. So she wants to know if adhering to its navigation system, such as the hamburger button and the fab, but not applying to the z-axis.
Right. If you would ask a material design, one of the Google employees who designed the material design, they would say absolutely not. One of the principles is two objects cannot be in the same physical space at the same time, two materials. And so you can't have that happen. I don't know how that affects development, if that is impossible developmental-wise. So there's that. Now, the flip side of the coin is we can build whatever we want. We can make the experience, assuming your developers are capable of it. The experience is what um, we think that the users want. And if we as designers feel either through our experience or through research or whatever the case may be, we really feel that we need to break the rules of either material design or iOS guidelines, then that's what we do. And because our allegiance is not to either of these giant companies. Our allegiance is to the end user who has their phone in their hand and is experiencing like our experience that we've given them. Um, anyway, I hope that makes sense. So break the rules.
Perfect. I think that answers the question that Jenny had. Are there any other questions from any other attendees?
Okay, if not, then I just kind of want to introduce you to the other two resources that I have on the slide. The first being the design guidelines. The other being, this is iOS's version of it's their human interface guidelines. It's quite a read, so make sure you've got some time and some mental focus, but it's really valuable to understand kind of not just how iOS apps are designed, but how Apple envisions all the elements to work, because it really explains a lot. Understanding the motivation of anything is super important when you are making decisions based around a system. And the third is another article from Google called Design from iOS to Android and Back Again. And it covers some of the principles that we talked about today, as well as some other areas. And this is the much more palatable version of those other two documents.
And I think we have one more question, Micah. So do you recommend developing a mobile app on a platform that can be adapted to iOS and Android, for example, HTML5, or developing in the specific operating system?
All right, so it goes back to the it depends answer, unfortunately. Although that one is a fairly easy decision to make based on the needs of your application. Platforms like PhoneGap and that sort of thing, where you're creating one version and then basically porting it into the different things, they work well. And then they're getting better every day. The downsides that you have to keep in mind is a lot of you're basically web-based, generally speaking. And so when you load a new page, they need to have the load times, even if it is stored locally, the load times are slower. The apps tend not to be as snappy. They just don't feel like quick and exciting and responsive like a natively developed application does. Also, the functionality can be much limited, or very limited. You may just need your app to do something complex that is just not supported very well, or you design it and then it just ports horribly. So if you have an application that's very simple, it uses elements that are in a lot of other apps, like a map or a list of one thing or another that goes to another screen to give you details. If the structure of your app is simple, then it can be a very cost-effective way to go down the kind of porting and one development route. However, if you have an enterprise style or just if you're really about like being innovative and exciting and interesting, then you pretty much need to go with a natively developed application. And unfortunately, that does mean two development teams.
Well, perfect, Micah. I think that's all the questions that everybody seems to have. Is there any other questions that are out there at all? Okay, well, thanks, Micah, for taking the time to enlighten us with your insights on translating design from iOS to Android and back again, and giving your perspective on all of the user experience and user interface design. And if anyone has any more questions for Micah, you're feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to jump on a call or answer a few questions via email and see how we can be helpful.
Great. Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
Thanks, everyone.